The wind over the valley carried a strange silence that morning, the kind that made even battle-hardened men feel something crawling beneath their skin. On the ridgeline sat a small Allied battery, 5 soldiers and a single artillery gun dug into a trench of frozen mud facing a narrow mountain pass that stretched east toward the lowlands. The map said the German armor would be here before sunset, rolling through in strength, and there would be nothing left to stop them. But the map did not account for one man, nor for the single forbidden shot that would change the battle entirely. Corporal Haynes had been an artillery spotter for barely 6 weeks. He was never supposed to command anything, not even the weather report. But the captain's jeep never came back from reconnaissance, and command had gone silent. When the 5 remaining men looked at Haynes for direction, the only thing he could offer was a compass, a half-dead radio, and an order written hastily in pencil that read, "Hold the pass, at any cost." Their gun was a 17-pounder camouflaged under netting and snow, its barrel pointing toward the eastern approach. They had only 7 shells, none of them armor-piercing. Against German panzers, those high-explosive rounds were as good as pebbles against steel. Yet as the sun climbed and the air grew still, the deep rhythmic sound of tank treads began to echo up the valley. Through a cracked pair of binoculars, Haynes saw the lead tank crest the far ridge, a panther blackened around its edges, moving with steady mechanical confidence. Behind it came 2 more, and behind them, half-tracks loaded with infantry. Private Lyle whispered that they couldn't dent those things, but Haynes said nothing. He just kept watching the road as it wound down toward a stone bridge at the valley's center. That bridge was the only crossing for 10 miles in either direction. If it fell, the entire column would choke in its own wreckage. But headquarters had marked the bridge as strategic. It was forbidden to target. Allied retreat routes depended on it. The order had been clear: protect, not destroy. Yet orders written in ink rarely survive contact with fire. As the first Panther reached the midpoint of the bridge, Haynes calculated distances in his head. Elevation 8 degrees down, wind 2 knots west. He turned the crank, steadied his breath, and gave the quiet command to load. Lyle hesitated, reminding him the shot was forbidden, but Haynes's eyes did not waver. The metallic click of the breech echoed through the trench, and then the thunder of the gun shattered the valley's silence. The shell struck directly under the tank's tracks, right at the bridge's keystone. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world split open. The stone arch collapsed in a roar of dust and flame, and the Panther plunged nose first into the crater, dragging 2 more vehicles behind it. A storm of smoke and shattered rock swallowed the road. For a moment, everything went still again. Then the second wave came. Half-tracks, soldiers scrambling to pull survivors from the debris, shouting orders drowned by the rising wind. Haynes ordered another round, and the gun answered with a deafening crack. The shells struck a line of fuel drums on a nearby transport, igniting them into a chain of explosions that lit the sky orange. The valley was now a cauldron of smoke, fire, and panic. The radio came alive with static, and a distant voice from battalion command broke through the noise asking for status. Haynes pressed the button and reported, "Bridge destroyed." Column halted, requesting immediate airstrike on Grid 47 Delta. There was silence on the other end, then disbelief. The officer repeated the words slowly, asking who authorized the bridge's destruction. Haynes didn't answer. He was too busy sighting the next shell. The reply came colder this time, warning that the bridge had been on the preservation list, that he had violated standing orders. Haynes only said, "We just bought you 2 hours," and dropped the handset. He turned back to the crew, sweat streaking the dust on his face, and told them they had 2 shells left and to make them count. The final rounds screamed into the advancing troops, ripping through their formations, scattering anything that still moved. When the smoke began to clear, the only sound left was the wind whistling through twisted steel. Then came a faint vibration in the air, a low, distant hum that grew louder by the second. Haynes looked up to see Allied dive bombers slicing through the smoke, following the trail of fire like an arrow to its target. The first bombs fell where his shells had landed, completing the destruction. The valley turned to flame. When it was over, Haynes stood at the trench's edge, staring down at what had once been the bridge. It was gone, nothing but a crater of molten stone and burning metal. Lyle crouched beside the gun and asked if that shot had really been forbidden. Haynes looked at the destruction and said quietly that sometimes the rule-book arrives too late. As darkness fell across the ridge, the last message of the day crackled through the radio. It was short, formal, and final. Outpost 7, position recorded as lost with honor. But they weren't lost. They had done what the situation demanded, holding the pass long enough for reinforcements to arrive and air support to clear the enemy column completely. In one decision, they had turned a hopeless stand into a victory that no report would ever fully credit them for. The story of that forbidden shot would never make the official records. Command would file it as a tactical delay, not an act of defiance. Yet every man who survived that ridge knew what had happened. A single disobeyed order had saved an entire flank. In the language of war, where hesitation costs lives and silence buries truth, that was as close to heroism as a man could get. And so the valley remained quiet once more, filled with the echoes of a gun that had done what was not allowed and changed what was possible. The smoke had barely cleared when the trucks arrived. Hours later, engines growling like restless beasts beneath the evening rain. Reinforcements from the western flank moved cautiously through the wreckage, headlights cutting thin tunnels of light through the haze. Corporal Haynes stood by the ruined gun, his uniform blackened with soot, eyes hollow from hours of staring into the valley that no longer existed. The bridge, the tanks, the bodies, all of it lay beneath a shroud of grey mist. He had done what no one dared, and the silence that followed was heavier than the explosions themselves. A captain climbed down from a transport, boots sinking into the mud, clipboard clutched like a weapon. He demanded a report. Haynes handed it over without a word. The officer's eyes flicked down the page, paused at the line that read, "Bridge destroyed by direct fire from Outpost 7, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he simply wrote one word in the margin, unauthorized. By dawn, they were ordered back to the rear for debrief. The march through the ruined valley was slow and haunting. They passed wrecks, still smoldering, tank hulls twisted like broken ribs, the smell of oil and gunpowder lingering in the air. Private Lyle walked beside Haynes, carrying the empty shell casing from their final shot as if it were something sacred. "Do you think they'll court-martial us?" he asked quietly. Haynes didn't answer. He knew the rules better than anyone. Disobedience, even with victory, carried a cost. When they reached the command tent, the interrogation began, not with anger, but with paperwork. The war machine didn't shout. It wrote. The officer behind the table read each line of Haynes's report, as if measuring his guilt by the length of the sentences. "You were given orders to hold, not to destroy." "Who authorized the fire?" Haynes said the words slowly. "I did, sir." The officer looked up. "You realize the bridge was a critical supply route?" Haynes nodded. "It was also a death trap, sir. For both sides." There was a pause, and for the first time the officer's face softened. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and said, "Command wants results, not headlines. They'll decide what to make of this." Then he dismissed him. For days, the rumor of Outpost 7 spread through the ranks like an underground current. Some said the crew had acted heroically, others said they'd gone rogue. Reports conflicted, but one truth remained. The German advance through that valley had stopped completely. When the Allied column moved in a week later, they found the enemy had withdrawn, leaving behind wrecked armor and frozen rations. The destroyed bridge had forced them to reroute through open terrain, where air support cut them to pieces. Strategically, Haynes's decision had saved an entire sector, but officially, no credit could be given. Weeks later, in a damp operations room somewhere near the front, a general reviewed the after-action files. He traced a finger over the name CPL Thomas Haynes and paused at the word forbidden. Then he drew a line through it, replacing it with executed under duress. It was the military's quiet way of turning defiance into discipline. The file was closed, stamped, and forgotten among thousands of others. Haynes never saw it again. When the war finally ended, he returned home to a small farm in the countryside. The silence of the fields was different from that of the battlefield. No smoke, no thunder, just the whisper of wind over wheat. Yet sometimes, late at night, he would hear it again, the echo of that single shot rolling through the mountains, the one that wasn't supposed to be fired. Neighbors would ask about his service, and he would always answer the same way: "We just did what we had to do." They never knew that one disobedient decision had rewritten the fate of a campaign. Years later, at a reunion, Lyle brought a faded photograph. It showed the 5 men standing by the gun before the battle, faces young, eyes steady, the world still intact behind them. On the back, he had written a single line: "The day the rules bent toward reason." They laughed quietly over old stories, but when talk turned to the bridge, the room went still. No one wanted to claim heroism. They all knew the truth. Sometimes survival demands an act the manuals can't describe. A historian, decades later, would stumble across their report in a dusty archive. The ink faded, but the words still legible. He read the entry about the forbidden shot and wrote a short note in the margin: "Tactical disobedience. Successful." That phrase would appear in a lecture at a military academy years after, though no one in the class would know the names of the men who made it possible. Corporal Haynes died quietly one winter evening. Long after the war's noise had faded from memory, his daughter found a box among his things. Inside it were medals, ration cards, and a spent shell casing polished to a shine. On a small slip of paper, folded and yellowed with age, he had written the coordinates of the valley. No words, no confession, just numbers, and the silence of a man who had carried both duty and guilt in the same heartbeat. In the end, history never mentioned Outpost 7. There were no monuments, no parades, only a forgotten line in an old report buried beneath decades of newer wars. Yet in that hidden valley, beneath the weeds and rusted steel, the echo of that forbidden shot still sleeps, a reminder that courage sometimes speaks the language of defiance, and that the line between right and wrong, in the chaos of war, is often drawn by the man who dares to pull the trigger. Long before Corporal Haynes ever stood behind his gun, the history of war had already been shaped by men who disobeyed orders and accidentally saved thousands. In 1940, during the desperate retreat to Dunkirk, a British artillery lieutenant named James Allen ignored a direct command to withdraw. His battery had been ordered to abandon their position, but Allen saw German columns closing in on trapped infantry at the beach road. He stayed, calibrating his guns for maximum delay fire without permission. The result was chaos in the enemy lines, buying 6 precious hours that allowed more than 1,000 soldiers to reach the boats. Official reports called it uncoordinated shelling, but veterans who witnessed it said quietly, that was the day a rule broke and hope survived. Another story emerged from the skies. In 1943, over Italy, American pilot Howard Miller was escorting a formation of B-17 bombers when his radio went dead. Cut off from command, he spotted flak bursts ahead and realized the group was flying straight into an ambush. Against regulation, he fired colored signal flares. Red meant abort, but headquarters had never authorized such codes in combat. The lead bombers turned back in confusion, missing the trap entirely. Intelligence later confirmed the German 88s had zeroed in on their original path. Miller's wing commander reprimanded him for unauthorized signal procedures, yet a week later quietly recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation never mentioned disobedience, only initiative under pressure. On the Eastern Front, similar defiance unfolded in silence. A Soviet anti-tank officer near Kursk refused to retreat when ordered. He had noticed the enemy armor funneling through a narrow gully and set up an ambush with remaining guns. His position was technically outside command's map grid, meaning any fire from there was unauthorized. When the German panzers entered, his hidden line destroyed 20 in minutes. Soviet reports later claimed it was a planned tactic, but witnesses said the officer acted entirely on instinct. He was promoted, then quietly reassigned to training, so no one could question the paperwork that had saved a sector. History remembers victories. It rarely admits how fragile they are. Many turning points, El Alamein, Midway, Bastogne, depended on individuals making impossible choices. Radar operators who stayed on duty after hours, engineers who modified engines without clearance, radio men who reused enemy frequencies against regulations. Each forbidden act risked court-martial. Yet these were the sparks that turned survival into strategy. In North Africa, one mechanic named Rossi Mixed captured German fuel additives into Allied desert trucks to prevent engine seizure in the heat. When his superior found out, Rossi expected punishment. Instead, a month later, supply trucks across the entire division were using the same mix, rebranded as an improved maintenance protocol. Innovation had been born from fear of failure and the refusal to watch machines die. Even the famous D-Day. Deception owed its success to rule breakers. Intelligence officers planted fake radio chatter using civilian actors, a direct violation of military communications law. Their improvised voices convinced German interceptors that the invasion would land at Calais, not Normandy. In retrospect, that illegal broadcast was one of the most successful strategic lies in modern history. And then there were the quiet acts of humanity, the forbidden shots not fired. In December 1944, an American sniper spotted a German medic dragging a wounded comrade through snow under a white flag. He lowered his rifle. His spotter whispered, "Orders are clear." The sniper answered, "Not today." Decades later, a letter surfaced from a former German soldier who had survived that day, describing the unseen marksman who spared him. Both men had lived long enough to know that disobedience could also mean mercy. All these threads weave a larger truth. Wars are fought by institutions, but won by individuals. The battlefield is a place where perfection collapses and instinct takes command. Manuals can teach tactics, not courage. Orders can map routes, not conscience. For every officially documented operation, there exist 100 unrecorded moments when someone bent a rule and history shifted a fraction toward survival. In that sense, the story of Corporal Haynes is not an exception. It is a mirror held up to the thousands whose decisions went unreported. Somewhere between discipline and desperation lies the thin line where humanity hides inside uniform cloth. Commanders call it insubordination. Historians later rename it brilliance. Yet the men who lived it called it something simpler, doing what the moment demanded. Years after the war, archives revealed dozens of similar reports labeled unauthorized but effective. They remain locked in military records, uncelebrated yet quietly acknowledged by those who understand the chaos of command. Modern military academies now teach case studies under sanitized terms like adaptive response under extreme duress. But soldiers in the field still whisper the older name, the forbidden shot, the choice that disobeys to save. If there is a lesson in all these stories, it is that obedience keeps armies alive. But courage, when guided by conscience, keeps nations human. Somewhere in a forgotten valley or beneath the roar of a passing jet, the echo of those unapproved moments still lingers. It is the sound of history correcting itself, one forbidden act at a time. Long after the smoke of battle had faded, those who had once lived by orders began to question what those orders truly meant. The war's end brought medals, tribunals, and parades, but also silence, an uneasy quiet that settled over men who had learned that doing right and doing what was ordered were not always the same. Corporal Haynes's name never appeared in any official citation. His forbidden shot was filed under unverified engagement, yet among his crew the story became something closer to legend. They said he had seen something no officer could have predicted, a brief alignment of instinct and impossibility, and had taken it. The column that should have broken through never did. In that instant, war bent to intuition. Decades later, historians began tracing these small ruptures in command, the cracks where discipline met conscience. What they found reshaped how we think about conflict. Declassified memos from Allied headquarters showed dozens of commanders quietly approving after-the-fact reports that described unofficial counterfire, unsanctioned movement, or improvised targeting. The language was careful, bureaucratic camouflage for human initiative. A pattern emerged. Moments of defiance were often the hinge on which whole operations turned. Psychologists studying combat behavior called it the instinct threshold, the point where training ends and the raw survival mind takes over. They discovered that soldiers who acted decisively outside of orders often shared a single trait, not recklessness, but empathy. They could sense, almost intuitively, the lives depending on them beyond the immediate chain of command. It was that same empathy that had driven Haynes and countless others to act when logic said wait. Meanwhile, the machines of war evolved faster than the doctrines that governed them. Jet propulsion, radar guidance, and proximity fuses demanded responses measured in seconds, not minutes. The human mind became both the weakest and strongest link in the system. When engineers designed the first automatic targeting computers, test pilots secretly disabled them during combat trials, claiming the algorithm's delay would get them killed. Those silent acts of refusal led to new feedback loops in design, because even in an age of precision, human intuition remained the ultimate variable. One historian, Dr. Ellen Mercer, compiled a classified oral history project in the 1970s, interviewing veterans who had taken forbidden shots. Her notes revealed a haunting similarity in tone. None of them bragged. They spoke softly, as if confessing to a necessary sin. A tank commander who disobeyed a retreat order at Arnhem said, "I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of my boys being cut down while I followed a map written by someone who wasn't there." Another, a bomber navigator over the Rhine, whispered, "The line between duty and guilt is thinner than a gun sight." Mercer concluded that the moral weight of disobedience haunted these men more deeply than fear ever had. Their victories carried no joy, only a quiet relief that someone, somewhere, had survived because they acted. She wrote, "They saved others, but sacrificed the comfort of obedience. In the hierarchy of valor, theirs is the courage no uniform can decorate." As nations rebuilt and the rhetoric of heroism filled textbooks, these forbidden moments faded to footnotes. Politicians preferred clean narratives, strategy, triumph, liberation. But within the veterans' reunions, the truth survived in the spaces between toasts. When they spoke privately, they used coded phrases, "That day I had to adjust," or "We made a field correction." Those who knew simply nodded. It was their way of honoring the grey truth that war leaves behind. By the time the Cold War began, military academies had quietly incorporated case studies based on these unsanctioned actions, stripped of names, but rich in lesson. Cadets learned about initiative under uncertainty and moral autonomy under duress. The very behavior once condemned as insubordination had become doctrine, proof that even institutions eventually learn from the instincts they once punished. In the digital age, as drone operators watched battles unfold from screens thousands of miles away, a new generation faced the same question Haynes had confronted in the mud. When the algorithm hesitates and human life hangs in the balance, who decides? Scholars of military ethics now cite the Haynes paradox, the recognition that sometimes disobedience preserves the very humanity that orders are meant to defend. Back in Oklahoma, where a rusting memorial stands near an old training field, a small plaque bears no rank. Only a line from a soldier's diary. "I broke a rule and bought a heartbeat of time." It was enough. No one knows who wrote it, yet visitors leave spent cartridges polished into pendants, a quiet ritual of remembrance for every nameless act of intuition that bent fate. War stories often end with victory or defeat. Few end with reflection. But the true legacy of the forbidden shot lies in what came after. The policies rewritten, the doctrines softened, the officers who learned that loyalty and conscience need not be enemies. Each generation of soldiers inherits not just tactics, but the echoes of those who dared to think. Somewhere in that lineage lives the same question. When the moment comes, will I obey or will I act? The answer, as history shows, can alter more than a battle. It can redefine what it means to be human within the machinery of war. History never repeats itself perfectly, but its echoes find new forms. The story of Corporal Haynes might have begun in the mud of a forgotten battlefield, yet its spirit traveled farther than the bullet he fired. Across continents, in other wars, other uniforms, the same invisible line between obedience and instinct reappeared again and again. Each time the consequences changed, but the question remained timeless. When the system freezes, does a single human pulse keep it alive? In the dense jungles of Vietnam, an American helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson witnessed unarmed civilians being massacred in a village called My Lai. His orders were to support the operation, but his conscience refused. Hovering low, he landed between soldiers and villagers, ordering his gunners to open fire if anyone advanced. His defiance saved lives and sparked outrage across the ranks. For years, he was branded a traitor. Decades later, history named him a hero. The forbidden shot had found its echo, this time not against an enemy, but against blind obedience itself. In 1983, on the other side of the world, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov sat before a glowing radar screen that screamed of incoming nuclear missiles from the United States. His protocol demanded immediate retaliation, a command that could have ended civilization. But something in his gut whispered doubt. The signal didn't feel right. Against every rule, he refused to push the button. Minutes passed. No warheads arrived. The alarm was false. Petrov's defiance saved the world, yet his name remained buried under decades of silence. His act was another kind of shot, one not fired but withheld. These moments form an unseen thread through history, a quiet lineage of defiance that protected life when orders could have destroyed it. The technology changed, uniforms changed, but the moral geometry of war remained. Orders flow downward, but conscience rises from within. That tension, the space between instruction and intuition, became the battlefield no doctrine could conquer. Modern militaries, driven by satellites, algorithms, and real-time data, often claim that human error is the weakest link. But hidden beneath that phrase is the truth that human empathy is also the strongest safeguard. In an era when war is fought by drones piloted from continents away, a single hesitation by a remote operator, a decision not to strike because a child entered the frame, can carry the same moral weight as Haynes's forbidden shot. War colleges began studying these incidents under a new discipline, ethical reflex theory. Professors taught that instinct, when grounded in conscience, could serve as the final defense against catastrophe. They cited Haynes, Thompson, Petrov, not as rebels, but as realists who understood that war without morality is just machinery devouring itself. The pattern is unmistakable. Every age has its Haynes. Every system creates its forbidden moment. The uniforms differ, green, khaki, digital camouflage, but the heartbeat beneath them sounds the same. Sometimes defiance becomes the last form of duty left to those who serve, yet not all defiance ends in salvation. In 1991, during the Gulf War, a British tank gunner disobeyed a fire order when his targeting scope revealed friendly units crossing the same sector. His commander accused him of insubordination. Hours later, radio reports confirmed his restraint had prevented a tragic friendly fire strike. The report was buried under equipment miscalibration. History spares few lines for those who prevent disasters. The world prefers stories of victory, not avoidance. But every avoided tragedy leaves a silent monument in time. philosophers of war began to revisit ancient texts, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, even the codes of samurai ethics, to search for this recurring moral contradiction. They found that across centuries, the wisest warriors understood a paradox. True loyalty sometimes requires disobedience. In Samurai Chronicles, there are tales of retainers who broke their lord's orders to protect civilians during sieges. Their descendants still pray for them not as sinners, but as men who upheld the deeper honor of compassion, from ancient archers to modern fighter pilots. The essence of the Forbidden Act remains constant. It is the collision between rule and reality, between command and conscience. That collision does not weaken armies. It reveals their humanity. Because without the capacity to question, a soldier becomes only a mechanism. As artificial intelligence begins to guide weapons, governments now debate whether machines can be trusted with lethal autonomy. A panel of ethicists at the United Nations recently invoked the same storylines: Haynes's instinct, Petrov's hesitation, Thompson's landing. They argued that no algorithm can replicate what those men felt, the pulse of empathy that interrupts destruction. Machines calculate risk, but they do not feel the tremor of a soul recognizing another life. In classified research, some defense agencies even began studying the neurological signatures of soldiers who made life-saving, forbidden decisions. Scans revealed heightened activity in areas of the brain associated with empathy and long-term moral reasoning, regions that training usually suppresses in high-stress combat. Ironically, the very human trait armies tried to discipline out of soldiers turned out to be what saved them from annihilation. One military philosopher summarized it perfectly. In every war, there comes a moment when obedience kills faster than bullets. The man who hesitates may save more than he knows. The story of the forbidden shot is not about disobedience. It is about responsibility, the kind that cannot be taught in manuals. It is about the invisible courage that refuses to surrender conscience to command. For every medal given for valor in action, there should be another for valor in hesitation, for those who broke a rule to preserve what rules were meant to protect. And so, when modern officers walk past the bronze statues and polished memorials of past wars, most never notice the small inscription beneath one statue's base, eroded by time. Sometimes, doing nothing is the hardest shot of all. Those who do notice stop for a moment, their reflection merging with the metal face of a forgotten soldier. They don't need to ask what battle he fought. They already know. As the smoke cleared from the shattered valley, silence fell over the men who had survived the impossible. Their guns, once roaring with defiance, now stood mute against the stillness of dawn. The forbidden shot had done more than destroy an armored column. It had shifted the very momentum of the battlefield. Reports from the forward observers came in disbelief. Enemy tanks immobilized, the valley regained, and what was once a certain defeat now a strange, trembling victory. Yet in the chaos of triumph, the gunner who had fired that single, rule-breaking round stood apart. His face was covered in dust, his uniform torn, but his eyes, tired, hollow, and almost afraid, were fixed on the black smoke curling into the sky. He had won the battle, yes, but deep down, he wondered if something sacred had been broken in the process. By evening, the field medics had cleared the wounded. The engineers were repairing what they could, and the officers had begun writing their reports, each one trying to explain, in bureaucratic language, what no regulation had ever prepared them for. The unauthorized firing solution was technically insubordination. Yet without it, the entire unit would have been overrun. How do you record such a contradiction? How do you file heroism that exists outside the rulebook? The commanding officer, torn between pride and duty, simply wrote, "Engagement concluded successfully by initiative under extreme circumstances." Nothing more. No mention of the decision that saved them all. No acknowledgement of the risk, the intuition, or the sheer defiance it took. Some truths were too strange to fit neatly in a line of official ink. Weeks later, the gunner's name would quietly spread through the ranks. Not in speeches or reports, but in whispers among the trenches, over coffee at outposts, and around campfires on sleepless nights. The man who aimed when he wasn't supposed to, they'd say. The one who took the forbidden shot. Some called it luck, others called it madness. But every soldier who'd ever faced the moment between survival and duty understood. They knew that sometimes war demanded decisions no manual could justify. In every generation of soldiers since, that story has survived, not as a legend of disobedience, but as a testament to the thin line between chaos and courage. Years later, long after the uniforms had faded and medals gathered dust in drawers, the gunner's grandson found an old dented shell casing in a wooden box. Inside it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. On it were the gunner's words, written in shaky pen. "I was told not to fire, but I did. Not out of anger, out of instinct, out of something human." The grandson looked up from the note, his reflection flickering in the old metal. He realized that history is not only built by orders followed, but by moments when someone dares to do what feels right, even when every voice says no. That single shot, born of desperation, had not only turned a battle, it had carried a lesson forward, one that outlasted the war itself. In war, there are moments that define not only victory, but humanity itself. The forbidden shot wasn't about breaking rules. It was about refusing to surrender when everything seemed lost. It was about instinct, sacrifice, and the fragile heartbeat of courage that drives people to act when logic says they shouldn't. History remembers battles by their outcomes, but stories like this remind us why they mattered. If this story moved you, take a moment, breathe, and remember that every act of courage, no matter how small, shapes the world we inherit. Subscribe to the channel for more untold human stories of war, where every bullet, every choice, and every heartbeat tells the truth behind history. Subscribe Last Uniform YouTube channel.